Today we're going to look at chapter 14, and you should see chapter 14 as a huge milestone. Why? It's the last chapter on the noun system. Now there are bits and pieces that you're going to learn as we go through the verbs, but this is almost all of the noun stuff you need to know. So congratulations. Not been that hard, has it? In chapter 14 we're going to learn relative pronouns. These are the words like who, and in its different inflected forms, whose and whom, same word, and that and which. This is not the interrogative. In other words, we have in English words that can perform multiple functions, kind of like a vowel toss. And sometimes, like who, can be an interrogative. Well, that's a different word. The relative pronouns don't ask a question, but they're the words who, that, and which. It's easier just to say it that way than try to define it, because the definition is pretty complex. The teacher whom the students love won the Teacher of the Year award. The glass that broke was my favorite. I sold the car whose color made me ill. Okay? If you have a sentence where the direct object is the teacher, take for example this. Ha didaskalan, han agapo. Han is a relative pronoun. It's accusative, as you might guess, right? It looks like a case ending with a vowel and a rough breathing, doesn't it? That's your clue. It's accusative, and it's masculine singular. And so this would say, the teacher whom I love. Okay, I must have felt the need for some affirmation at this point in my life when I wrote this, but okay. Whom I love, han agapo, is your relative clause. In other words, the relative pronoun and what follows it is called the relative clause. And han is the relative pronoun. Notice several things. The relative pronoun will be the first word in the clause. It'll introduce the clause just like a preposition introduces a prepositional phrase. Secondly, how would you guess Greek determines the case of a relative pronoun? Now, it's not an adjective, but it introduces the relative clause. But what you do on relative clauses is you kind of put parentheses around them because they're self-contained units. They're going to have a relative pronoun, and they're going to have a verb and a subject because they're clauses. Well, the case of the relative pronoun is determined by its function inside the relative clause. It doesn't modify another word. The relative pronoun introduces the clause, but is performing a function inside the clause, and that's what determines its case. So why is han accusative in this example? Because it's the direct object of the verb agapo. And what I do is I replace the pronoun with its antecedent if I'm trying to figure out case. Whom I love, well, the subject is I, agapo. I love whom? I love the teacher. I love whom? Okay, han is accusative. So the case of a relative pronoun is determined by its function inside the relative clause. Thirdly, how do you think Greeks determine the gender and number of a relative pronoun? Right, it's antecedent, what it stands for. You may not know it here, but it's not following natural gender. Why is han masculine? Because didaskalan is masculine. Why is han singular? Because didaskalan is singular. So even if I were a woman, didaskalan is still a masculine noun, and so the relative pronoun will be masculine. So case is determined by function within the relative clause. Gender and number are grammatically determined by the gender and number of the antecedent. Now, in the process of translating that, you may have to find that you have to move the English around a bit. Let's say, for example, didaskalan were a neuter word, then the relative pronoun would be neuter, but you couldn't translate it as it, because I'm not an it. And fourthly, relative clauses are dependent clauses. What does that mean? What's the point we've been making when I've been talking about this? It will not contain the main verb and its subject in the sentence. Now, there will be a verb and a subject in a relative clause. You have to have a verb in a relative clause, but it's not going to be the main verb of the sentence. In terms of the form of the relative pronoun, it's really straightforward. It looks like a case ending with the initial vowel appropriate for the declension. It's a 2-1-2 word. Notice that it always has a rough breathing and it always has an accent. These are just the singular forms. Plurals follow the same rules. Now this becomes important in the nominative, masculine and neuter, when you compare them to the article. Okay, because the article is not going to have an accent in those cases. So the way I remember it is that as I look at a form, if it looks like a case ending with the vowel and it has a rough breathing and an accent, it's always the relative pronoun. And you know its forms. All right, you're done with nouns. Cool.